On a warm afternoon in a quiet, wealthy neighborhood, a silver gate creaked open to reveal a mansion that looked more like a museum than a home. Marble floors, grand chandeliers, and rooms so large they echoed. But inside all that luxury lived a kind of silence, the kind that doesn't come from peace, but from pain. Inside the house, a little boy sat in a specially made chair near the window. His name was Daniel, 8 years old, beautiful brown eyes, and trapped in his own body because of cerebral palsy. He couldn't speak, he couldn't walk, but he understood everything. His father, Mr. Richard Hale, was a tech tycoon, 42 years old, always dressed sharp, richer than most people could imagine. But since his wife had passed away giving birth to Daniel, he'd been a ghost in his own house, busy, distant, alone. On that day, a garden party was happening on the back lawn. Tables with white cloth, soft music playing, rich guests sipping drinks and pretending to care about charity. Richard's sister-in-law, Eleanor, floated between conversations like she owned the place. Pearls around her neck, smile too perfect, voice always just loud enough to be heard. Then her voice turned sharp. "Get out of this house, now!" The guests turned. Eleanor was standing at the top of the staircase, pointing at a woman, a young black woman, holding Daniel in her arms. "Did you see her? Digging through the office drawers?" Eleanor's voice cut like a knife. "Who knows what she's stolen?" The woman didn't flinch. Her name was Grace Lewis, 34, calm, steady, dignified. She looked Eleanor in the eye and said softly, "I was just putting away Daniel's drawings, like I do every day." Daniel clung to her tightly, his face pressed against her shoulder. His wide eyes said it all. "Don't let her go." "I keep his art supplies in that drawer," Grace said, holding her ground, even as the whispers started among the guests. "I always have." Footsteps echoed. Richard had appeared at the top of the stairs, frowning. "What's going on?" "I caught your perfect nanny going through your office," Eleanor said smugly. "I told you from the start, someone like her isn't fit to care for Daniel." Richard looked at Grace, then at his son. Daniel, the boy who rarely showed emotion, was holding on to her like his life depended on it. "Come to my office," Richard said firmly. "Both of you." Behind the heavy office door, the noise of the party faded. Richard opened the drawer. Inside, neatly stacked, were colorful scribbles, painted with care. Daniel's art. "He made these?" Richard asked, his voice softer now. "Yes," Grace said, nodding. "I adapted the brushes so he could grip them. Today he used red for the first time." Richard stared at one of the pages. It was bright red, the color of the dress his wife wore when they first met, the color she chose for the nursery she never got to see. "He remembers," Grace said gently. "He understands much more than people realize." 3 months earlier, Grace had walked into that house for the first time. No fancy clothes, no polished accent, just quiet confidence, a degree in special education, and eyes that didn't look at money. They looked at the boy. When she met Daniel, she didn't greet Richard, or Eleanor, or anyone else. She crouched down to Daniel's eye level and said, "Hi, champ. Mind if I sit with you?" And that day, for the first time in years, Daniel's eyes lit up. Eleanor never liked Grace. "Do you really think a woman like her should be here?" she had whispered on the first day. "Think of the family's reputation." But Grace stayed, and Daniel changed. First it was his gaze, then small sounds, then attempts to move, little victories only Grace seemed to notice. Back in the office, Grace stood tall. "I know how this looks," she said, "but I also know what your son is capable of, and I'm not going anywhere." Richard looked at her and saw not a nanny, but the first person who had truly seen his son, and something in him began to shift. 3 months earlier, when Grace Lewis first entered the Hale mansion for her final interview, the house felt cold, not because of the marble floors or the high ceilings, but because of something deeper, a kind of emptiness that even money couldn't hide. Richard Hale had been through a long list of caregivers, nurses, therapists, tutors. None of them stayed, none of them connected. His son Daniel didn't speak, didn't move much, and barely reacted to anyone, until Grace. Richard still remembered that moment. She didn't smile at him, didn't compliment the decor. She went straight to Daniel, bent down, looked him in the eyes. "Hi, champ," she had said softly. "Can I sit with you?" And Daniel had looked at her, really looked. It wasn't much, but it was more than anyone else had managed in years. Eleanor, Richard's sister-in-law, hadn't liked her from the start. "We need someone more presentable," she whispered as Grace organized Daniel's books. "Someone who fits our image." But Richard, he was tired of images. He was tired of masks. And something about Grace felt different. She didn't flinch in that big, lonely house. And more importantly, Daniel responded to her. Little by little, the boy began to change. It started with longer eye contact, then a hand movement here, a faint sound there. Grace understood them all. She knew his patterns, knew when he was trying to say yes, when he was trying to say no, and she always listened. Richard found himself watching them sometimes, quietly, from a distance. Grace had turned a corner of the cold mansion into something warmer. Music sometimes played softly. Art supplies lay scattered, not in mess, but in possibility. There were even small laughs, digital sounds from a simple device Grace had brought, trying to teach Daniel to choose his own sounds. And Daniel, his eyes shone more, his body moved more, slowly, carefully, but surely. Then came the charity garden party, the moment Eleanor humiliated Grace in front of everyone, accused her of stealing. Richard had stepped in, led them to his office, and that's where he saw it all. The proof, Daniel's artwork, the bright reds, the vibrant shapes, and Grace's quiet voice explaining how she'd adapted the brushes, how Daniel was remembering. Something inside Richard cracked that day. But what surprised him most was what Grace said after the confrontation. "This isn't the first time I've faced something like this, Mr. Hale," she said calmly, "and I know it won't be the last." There was no bitterness in her tone, just strength, like a woman who had walked through fire more than once, and kept walking. Richard sat back, watching her. What had she been through? Why did she keep showing up for children like Daniel? She could have taken easier jobs, safer paths. But she was here, and Daniel, his son, was finally alive in a way he hadn't seen since the day he was born. Later that night, Grace sat in the small room at the back of the mansion, the one the other caregivers had used and quickly abandoned. She opened a worn notebook, dated the page, day 94. Daniel used his communicator to choose his clothes today, maintained eye contact for 47 seconds, new record. She wrote it down slowly, carefully. Then, the door burst open. Eleanor stood there, smirking. "So this is what you do when you're alone?" she said. "Write about us?" Grace stood up and calmly took the notebook from her hands. "It's a professional journal," she said. "Part of the protocol. Mr. Hale is aware." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "A nanny who keeps scientific records. How cute." Grace didn't blink. "I have a degree in cognitive neuroscience from Columbia University," she said. Eleanor froze for just a moment, then smiled again, condescending. "So that's what this is? Trying to impress Richard? Climb the ladder? Use your degrees to get ahead through the back door?" Grace said nothing, but her silence held weight, because she wasn't trying to climb. She was trying to protect something Eleanor never understood. And that night, Grace knew something for certain. This time she wasn't backing down. The next morning something happened in the Hale mansion that hadn't happened in years. Richard Hale showed up to breakfast, without his usual suit. No tie, no phone, just him, casual shirt, tired eyes, and a look of uncertainty. "I thought I'd spend the morning with you two," he said, clearing his throat. Grace glanced up from the table, surprised. Daniel sat in his chair, blinking at his father. For a moment the room felt unsure of itself, like no one knew how to behave in this version of the day. But then Grace smiled softly. "We're about to start a music therapy session," she said. "You're welcome to join." Richard nodded. "I'd like that." In the playroom, Daniel's world came alive. Grace placed a colorful xylophone in front of him, one designed with padded mallets and weighted keys, so his limited movements could still create sound. With slow effort, Daniel reached for a mallet. He struck one note, then another, then a third. His eyes widened. He smiled. Not a big smile, but a real one. Richard stared, stunned. "He played that?" he asked, almost whispering. "Yes," Grace said. "He has rhythm. He responds to patterns. He loves melody." "How did you know?" "I paid attention." Grace's voice was simple, steady. "People think nonverbal children have no opinions. That's the mistake. They have preferences. They have feelings. They just don't always have a way to express them." Later that day, as Grace cleaned up the room, Janet, the longtime housekeeper, pulled her aside. She spoke in a low voice, glancing toward the hallway. "Miss Eleanor is checking your references," she whispered. "I heard her on the phone. She said she'd find something, anything, to expose who you really are." Grace didn't flinch. "It's not the first time," she said quietly. Janet's voice softened. "Mrs. Rebecca, she was kind, but Eleanor always had her claws in everything. I've seen her get rid of 3 nurses and 2 therapists, just because she didn't like the way they spoke, or dressed, or looked." "And Daniel is the one who always suffers," Grace murmured. "Exactly," Janet replied. "But I've never seen him respond to anyone like you." Grace closed her eyes, then opened them with quiet resolve. "I'm not leaving, not this time." After Janet left, Grace opened her laptop. She typed a short email to a contact listed only as Professor Whitman. Subject: urgent. "I may need the document sooner than expected. Situation escalating." That evening, Eleanor cornered Richard in the hallway. "Don't you think it's odd?" she asked. "A woman with her alleged background, working as a nanny? Don't you find that strange?" Richard paused, looked up from his tablet. "Maybe she just cares," he said. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Come on, Richard, don't be naive. People like her always have an angle." Richard's face changed. He put the tablet down. "What exactly do you mean? People like her?" Eleanor blinked, caught off guard. But before she could answer, Grace was already on a video call in her room. The screen showed 3 people: Dr. James Whitman, a neurologist, Sarah Chun, a disability rights lawyer, and a third figure from the Columbia Research Department. "I've gathered the documentation," Dr. Whitman said. "We may be looking at medical negligence." "Not just negligence," Grace added. "Deliberate sabotage. Daniel has abilities, but he's been actively blocked, over and over." Sarah nodded. "Some of these refusal of treatment forms are questionable. Are you certain his father signed them?" Grace's voice was quiet, but firm. "I'm almost certain they were forged." The next morning, Richard walked into his office and found a box on his desk. Inside was an advanced communication device, sleek, adaptive, expensive. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "I have contacts at Columbia," Grace replied. "Assistive Technology Department." She didn't mention the favors she'd called in. The nights she'd stayed up preparing reports, the quiet network of experts who believed in her work. Later that afternoon, Daniel used the new device. He tapped a few buttons. A robotic voice spoke. "More music." Richard turned away to hide the tears in his eyes. That evening, as if timed perfectly, Eleanor entered the room with a smug grin and a manila envelope. "I found out who she really is," she said, waving the papers. "And once you read this, you'll finally understand why I've been trying to protect you." But Grace, she didn't flinch. She smiled, just slightly, like someone who already knew what move was coming and was ready for it. Eleanor's voice rang with confidence as she handed the envelope to Richard. "Her real name is Dr. Grace Lewis," she said, as though revealing a secret weapon. "Not just a nanny, but some kind of neuroscience expert who used to work at Columbia University, until she was mysteriously dismissed 2 years ago." Richard looked at Grace, confused. Grace didn't blink. She gently rested her hand on Daniel's shoulder and said, "Yes, I am Dr. Grace Lewis." Eleanor stepped forward. She was suspended, removed from her program for using controversial methods, and now she's using your son as some kind of experiment, without your consent. Grace stood slowly, calm, composed. "I'm surprised it took you this long to find that out, Eleanor," she said. "Your private investigators need better training." Richard's eyes searched hers. "Is it true?" Grace nodded. "Yes, I was removed because I exposed the deliberate sabotage of experimental treatments for children with cerebral palsy. Treatments that were working, treatments that were stopped because of pressure from an anonymous donor." Eleanor's jaw tightened. Grace turned to Richard. "May I use your computer?" He nodded cautiously. She plugged in a small flash drive. The screen lit up with official documents, files bearing the letterhead of the hospital where Daniel was born. "I found these in your office while organizing Daniel's records," she explained. "Forms refusing advanced therapies over the past few years, all supposedly signed by you." She enlarged one of the scanned signatures. "Is this your signature?" Richard leaned in, squinted, then shook his head slowly. "I've never seen this form before." "Because you didn't sign it," Grace said. She clicked again. Another document appeared, this one with notes from handwriting experts. "They're forged." Eleanor took a step back. "This is ridiculous," she spat. "She's trying to create drama, chaos. You can't possibly believe this." Grace cut her off, her voice sharper now. "The anonymous donor who halted my research at Columbia?" Another click, another document. "It was the Bennett Family Foundation." Eleanor's full name glowed on the screen. "Eleanor Bennett." The room went quiet. Richard looked at his sister-in-law with something colder than anger, betrayal. "She feared that if Daniel improved," Grace said, her voice steady, "she'd lose her control over you and over the estate." "Lies!" Eleanor shouted. "She's manipulating you. She invaded this home." But before she could go on, Daniel's voice filled the room, a robotic voice, from the device. "Victoria, lie!" Everyone froze. Grace stepped forward. "The device has a diary function. Daniel's been recording, even when no one thought he understood." Richard knelt beside his son, his voice trembling. "Daniel, do you understand what's happening?" The boy tapped again. "Always. I understand everything." Eleanor turned pale. "He's not capable of that. He's not—" "That's exactly the problem," Grace said firmly. "He is. He always was. You just made sure no one found out." At that moment, Janet entered quietly, holding a large box. "The documents you asked for, Doctor. Lewis." "What are those?" Richard asked, rising to his feet. "Original treatment records," Grace replied. "The ones Eleanor ordered destroyed. Janet kept them safe." I couldn't let that happen, Janet said softly. Mrs. Rebecca would have wanted her son to have every opportunity. Richard took the files, flipped through them. His face changed, page by page, from disbelief to pain to fury. Years, he whispered, years of stolen chances. Grace nodded. And today, in front of everyone, Columbia is announcing the relaunch of my research, fully funded, fully approved. It's now called the Hampton Project for Assisted Communication. The front door opened, and in walked Dr. Whitman, along with journalists, lawyers, and university officials. Dr. Grace Lewis, Whitman announced, smiling. Congratulations, your work has federal approval, and your first official ambassador. He turned to Daniel. Is Michael Hale? Cameras flashed. Eleanor tried one last time. She's just an opportunist, a manipulative outsider. But Richard cut her off. She's a black woman with 3 doctorates, he said, his voice cold, who gave my son something you tried to take away, a voice. More flashes. Grace stood tall beside Daniel, calm, unshaken. And Daniel? He tapped his device one more time. Grace, stay, home. That one word, home, silenced everything, because the boy who had never spoken had finally made himself heard. In the days that followed, the mansion began to change. It wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no speeches or ceremonies, just small, steady things, laughter in the hallways, music in the morning, Daniel choosing his own clothes, tapping his communication device to say, blue shirt, or music first. Grace was there for it all. And Richard? He didn't just return to fatherhood. He showed up. He sat with Daniel during therapy, learned the communication systems Grace had developed, ate breakfast without rushing out the door. The man who had once buried himself in work and silence was now the one helping Daniel use a new feeding system, or clapping along as he tapped a melody on the keyboard. Even the staff noticed. Mr. Hale's smiling more these days, Janet said one morning. First time I've seen him laugh since Rebecca passed. Daniel's progress was no less incredible. Within just 3 months of proper, focused therapy that had been denied to him for years, he learned to control a joystick. He began forming full sentences through his device. His favorite phrase? More grace, more music, happy. But not everyone was celebrating. Eleanor disappeared from the public scene after the scandal broke. Her name was quietly removed from the Bennett Foundation. Charity events stopped calling, and the lawsuit she tried to file against Richard for defamation? Dismissed, instantly. The evidence was too clear, too damning. The judge even recommended a criminal investigation for document fraud. One morning, Janet set a letter on the breakfast table. From Miami, she said softly. It was from Eleanor, a formal apology. Richard read it in silence, then placed it aside. Later that day, he made a quiet donation to a scholarship fund for Black neuroscience students, in Eleanor's name. When Grace saw the donation notice, she looked at Richard. He just smiled and said, "Redemption doesn't start with letters. It starts with action." Meanwhile, the Hampton Project was growing fast. Daniel's story had gone viral. Videos of him using his communication device reached millions. News stations picked it up. Politicians mentioned his name in discussions about disability rights. Parents from all over the country started asking, "Why didn't my child have this sooner?" And soon, the Hampton Project opened centers in 3 more states. One afternoon, while Daniel splashed in the hydrotherapy pool, Grace stood poolside reviewing notes. Richard walked over with a manila folder in his hand. "I need you to see this," he said, offering it gently. Grace opened the folder. Inside, a proposal from Columbia University, a research center, fully funded, named in her honor. But the title at the top read something else: the Michael Hale Center for Assistive Communication. Grace blinked, then smiled. They want me to run it? They voted unanimously, Richard said. They want you. As scientific director, Grace swallowed the lump in her throat. Daniel, floating nearby, tapped his device. Grace teach other kids? She nodded, her eyes misting over. Yes, champ, thousands of them. On opening day, the line of families stretched around the block. Children in wheelchairs, parents holding hands, hope in their eyes. Grace stood at the entrance in a navy blazer, giving interviews as Daniel and Richard prepared to cut the ribbon. Dr. Lewis, a reporter asked, how does it feel to finally have your work recognized? Grace paused, then smiled. It was never about recognition, she said. It was about giving a voice to those who were forced into silence. The cameras turned to Daniel, now seated in a motorized chair. He controlled himself. He smiled proudly, tapped his new device, and a clear, confident voice rang out. Grace showed the world that I'm here. I've always been here. Now, everyone can see. That night, the celebration raised over $2 million for treatment grants. As they sat at the head table, Daniel surprised everyone again. Grace, Nova, Mom. Silence. Richard looked at Grace, his eyes full of both awe and question. Grace leaned toward Daniel. You'll always carry your mom, Rebecca, in your heart, she said gently. I would never take her place, but if you and your dad would allow it, I'd be honored to become part of your family. And then Richard stood up, pulled a small box from his pocket. I wasn't planning to do this tonight, he said, laughing nervously, but apparently my son has a strong sense of timing. He turned to Grace. You taught us that love isn't loud. It's steady, brave, and unshakable. You gave my son a voice, and you gave me back my heart. Grace Lewis, will you marry me? Tears streamed down her face. She nodded. And Daniel? He pressed the happy button over and over, filling the room with laughter, beeps, and joy. The mansion that once echoed with cold silence now pulsed with love, not perfect, but real and full of sound.